welcome to episode 3 in this series talking about change. This episode will discuss climate change. In this series, generally, we demonstrate how certain key ideas around change can be applied across the full range of human activity and experience, from boosting your motivation all the way up to building a better understanding of the global financial crisis of 2007-2008. A basic idea around change that we will explore in this series is to understand change as the structuring of fluidity. By fluidity, I mean what makes for the changeability of a situation. That is, what makes it possible for that situation to change at all. So before I go into talking about climate change, I'd like to provide you with a simple example of that idea, that key idea, the idea that change is can be seen as the structuring of fluidity. That change is the structuring of fluidity. And that simple example is the turning liquid water into ice. Well, liquid water is able to flow by its very nature. The particles that make up the water move past each other freely, but they still have enough attraction to each other as water molecules to hold together as a body. This flow, as with the flow of a stream, for example, is the movement that occurs in warm weather. As the circumstances change and the winter approaches, the weather becomes colder and colder. As this happens, the molecules lose more and more heat energy, and the forces of attraction between the molecules come to prevail. Now the molecules can bind together to make up the ice. The regular arrangement of water molecules is a lattice. The ice has that form after the action binding the molecules in uniform ways. Essentially, the loose association of the molecules in the body of liquid water becomes an orderly arrangement of molecules in the process of freezing. So this is the structuring of the water's fluidity under its change from liquid water to ice. So that was the key idea that I wanted to exemplify. Change is the structuring of fluidity. But there were also other ideas related to that key idea as well. One, the change is made up of an interacting complex of particular circumstances, the cold weather in this case, actions, the bonding and arraying of water molecules, and form or forms. Here the form is ice, a solid state of matter. So another related idea for change is that change is driven by a reworking of connections, the making, breaking, and remaking of those connections. In this case, change is driven by the connections made among molecules as bonds in its solid form. Those then are the ideas around change to highlight. Change is the structuring of fluidity. Change is made up of a complex of circumstances, actions, and forms in dynamic interplay. And change is driven by the reworking of connections. And we'll see how those ideas play out, not only climate change as illustrated in this episode, but in other domains or areas of change that will be discussed in other episodes. We've already seen this. With regard to fluidity and the concept of fluidity, the fluidity of a situation is the first thing that you should think about when you're thinking about how change occurs. So recall in episode 1, speaking was inherently fluid, unlike writing, because thoughts were taking form in real time in this tacit exchange between the speaker and listeners in an audience. In episode 2, we saw that anxiety is a free-floating fear. That's the fluid aspect. And coping with it required fixing in place that fear to make it concrete and amenable to managing. That's the structuring of that fluidity. So in this episode, we're going to apply these ideas to climate change. Now, to understand the fluidity at play here, one must recognize the scale of time relevant. Climate and trends in it are considered over decades, centuries, thousands of years, millions of years. That is in geologic time. What happens tomorrow is weather. What happens over these longer time periods is climate. So now if you look at trends over these time periods, you can see a lot of variability in temperature and precipitation as two principal aspects of the climate to look at. So during the last ice age, about 20,000 years ago, the climate was colder and drier than it is today. The global average temperatures were 5 to 10 degrees Celsius, or 9 to 18 degrees Fahrenheit, if you use that scale, below today's temperature norms. Now, with so much water locked up in ice, the rainfall during the Ice Age was on average half of what it is today. Such variability is where there is fluidity in the climate. There are different regimes of climate for different geologic periods. The overall parameters of the climate will fall into certain patterns during any given geologic period. The circumstances that prevail during the geologic period drive this variability. For example, the level of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, especially methane, can help determine temperatures. These greenhouse gases are very effective in capturing heat in the atmosphere. The higher the levels of these greenhouse gases, the better the atmosphere is at trapping heat, and the higher the average temperature over the long term. During the Ice Age, carbon dioxide was just 180 parts per million, while now it is 415 parts per million. So we've gone from 180 parts per million in the last Ice Age to 415 parts per million of carbon dioxide now, currently. Since the start of the Industrial Revolution around the mid-18th century, there has been a steady rise in carbon emissions put into the atmosphere, and with it, a long-term trend of increasing temperature. Now, the Earth is a complex system where there are sources of such greenhouse gases as well as sinks for them. In the current period, the sources include emissions from the burning of fossil fuels, from factories, cars, businesses, buildings, homes, and a host of other human activities. Sinks in the system that absorb these carbon emissions include forests, jungles, and oceans. Greenhouse gases are going to flow from sources to sinks in the complex system that is the Earth. The form that this has taken for us today, largely shaped by human activity, is a rapidly accelerating change in temperature and other factors associated with the climate. While other periods of time in the Earth's history have witnessed changes in climate, the change usually occurs over relatively long periods of time, allowing the Earth and its inhabitants time to adapt. What is distressing about climate change now is how rapidly the temperature and other climatic conditions are changing. And that's outstripping the ability of living beings on the Earth to adapt to the new circumstances. Consequently, species have become extinct at alarming rates, and we human beings have been challenged by ever-increasing droughts, floods, fires, among other environmental challenges. The connections that were made between an organism and its environment in order to adapt effectively have been broken. We, as a species, have been especially challenged in maintaining harmonious connections to our home planet Earth. To restore those connections, we must rebalance the sources and sinks for our greenhouse gases. For example, by limiting our fossil fuel burning on the source side and preserving and even expanding our forests and jungles on the sink side of the Earth system. By reworking these connections, the variability, the fluidity that we expect to see in climate will be structured in such a way that we make our Earth hospitable for us and all other living beings with whom we share the Earth. We can modify the circumstances that shape our climate to decelerate these destabilizing changes, especially the rapid temperature rise. New ways of being on Earth sustainably can create new forms of living our lives. We can imagine and establish positive and harmonious connections with each other, with other living beings, and with the Earth as a whole. So, if you found this episode provoked your thinking about climate change, and you'd like to support me in developing more content that relates to change in all its forms, head over to my page on patreon.com/talkingaboutchange, all lowercase and strung together, patreon.com/talkingaboutchange, and become a patron. Thank you, and all the best to you.